This is a map showing the percentage of adults who are highly religious per state. Looking at it, you'll notice this southern region over here is much more distinct than the rest. In fact, it's so distinct, it even has its own name, the Bible Belt. Protestant Christianity plays a strong role in society here, and church attendance across the denominations is much higher than the nation's average. But why is that? Why is this part of America so much more religious than the rest? I mean, New England was literally founded by Puritans who thought Europe was too godless and is now the most atheistic region in the Union. So what's happened? To understand this religious flip-flop and the intensity of it in the South, we need to go all the way back to the beginning, and I mean back to the literal founding of the 13 colonies themselves, with the first one being Jamestown, Virginia, in 1607. Like with many other European powers at the time, economic reasons were the best way to sum up the motivations for colonization, and the British colonizing North America was no different. So people were sent to live in this area to establish a British settlement here. And since they came from England, where the Church of England, aka the Anglican Church, was the official state religion, the people who made up this region were mostly Anglican. The thing is, though, the Church of England, at this point in time, had only been separated by the Roman Catholic Church and turned into a Protestant Anglican country since 1534, and even then there were some brief restorations of Catholicism, like under the reign of Queen Mary I from 1553 to 1558. So the point I'm trying to make is, even though the Church of England was technically Anglican, there were still many retained elements of Catholicism in it. And this is when the Puritan movement became a thing, because they were a group of people who wanted to purify the church from what they viewed as Catholic practices and to implement a more rigorous form of worship and church governance. But the thing is, their efforts and beliefs caused tension and persecution, causing them to flee the country and to create a society in the manner they believed God truly intended it to be designed. So from 1620 to 1640, there was a Puritan migration to the New England colonies of British America, with as many as 20,000 of them making the trip over, mostly in families as opposed to isolated individuals, and establishing the now Plymouth colony, the second permanent English colony in America after Jamestown. So at this point in time, there was basically a religious divide between Puritanism in the north and the Anglicans in the south. This was reflected in their living too, with the Puritans establishing a society deeply rooted in their faith, with strict moral codes and a focus on community worship. The Puritans' influence was so profound that it permeated nearly every aspect of life in New England, from governance to daily routines. Meanwhile, in the South, and it's not to say they weren't religious at all, because they certainly were, but their motivation for the settlement was largely economic from the start, focused on agriculture, trade, and that sort of stuff. The establishment of the Anglican Church in these colonies was part of replicating English societal structures and maintaining loyalty to the Crown. There were also a mix of other denominations among settlers too, meaning that there was no one central religious identity that held all the power. So as a result, the societal structure in southern states like Virginia were more hierarchical and less centered around religion compared to the Puritan North. Then things started to change. You see, while the original Puritan settlers were this very religious bunch, as time passed, the second and third generations of settlers who were born in the along with this, there was also a geographical factor at play. While both regions started off with agriculture as the main business, the geography and climate of New England is less conducive to large-scale agriculture than those of the South. New England has rocky soil, a relatively rugged terrain, and a shorter growing season, making large-scale farming more challenging. In contrast, the South has more fertile soil and a longer growing season, which supports large plantations. This meant that New England's economy diversified early on. Fishing, shipbuilding, and trade were significant economic activities alongside farming. The region's abundant water power from its rivers also was a key factor in its early industrialization. New England became a center for manufacturing, with industries like textiles and clockmaking growing rapidly from the end of the 18th century. And this industrial growth spurred urban development as people moved to cities for factory jobs. So while the South did care about their economy, obviously, they were and have been able to maintain a more agricultural focus, having been initially based on cash crops like tobacco, cotton, and rice, which relied heavily on slave labor. And this agricultural focus created a much different economic trajectory compared to the North's industrialization, with theirs starting much later, particularly after the Civil War. Obviously, the impact on religion of this was also key. The more rural and agricultural nature of much of the South for a longer period helped maintain a traditional, community-centered way of life, where the church played a significant role, whereas the industrialization and hence urbanization of the North led to the growth of public education, which often lead to increased exposure to diverse viewpoints and a greater emphasis on secularism. Now, I realize I basically just time jumped from the beginning and development of these 13 colonies to the end of the Civil War, but it was also everything that happened between these two time periods that heavily contributed to making the US South much more religious than the North. Simply put, the Great Awakening. This contrasting religious situation gave rise to what historians refer to as the declensionist narrative. This perspective suggested that while the initial settlers in New England were highly devout, their descendants gradually lost this fervor. In contrast, the South, with its less intense religious practices, was seen as somewhat spiritually lackluster. To many observers of the time, especially from the North, the South appeared almost spiritually dead in comparison to the religious zeal of New England. This narrative, however, oversimplifies the complexity of the religious landscape in early America. Don't get me wrong, while it's true that the Puritans in the North were more visibly devout in their practices, the South still had its own unique religious identity somewhat, especially with Anglicanism. The Anglican Church still played a crucial role in the social and cultural fabric of Southern life, with its rituals, traditions, and hierarchy being integral to the region's societal structure. As we dive deeper into the religious history of America, it becomes evident that these early religious differences set the stage for the distinct paths the North and the South would take in their religious journeys. Ironically, the Puritan influence in the North gradually gave way to more secular views over time, while the South, with its Anglican roots, would experience the exact opposite, a different kind of religious evolution.
The First Great Awakening, 1730s-40s. However, another transformative era reshaped this landscape even further, the First Great Awakening of the 1730s and 40s. This movement, sweeping across the colonies, marked a stark departure from the more reserved religious practices of the past. It brought to the forefront dynamic figures like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards, who wanted to revive religion in North America and whose preaching styles infused American religious life with a new intensity. George Whitefield, an English minister, traversed the colonies, captivating immense crowds with his powerful and emotional sermons. He had a unique ability to connect with his audience on a deeply personal level, often moving them to tears or spiritual awakening. Similarly, Jonathan Edwards, a preacher from New England, made a long-lasting, influential impact with his sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, emphasizing God's wrath upon unbelievers after death to a very real, horrific, and fiery hell. Edwards' method of preaching was characterized by vivid imagery and a passionate delivery that appealed directly to the emotions and fears of his listeners. This period of revivalism, driven by such charismatic preaching, was not just about religious teachings. It was an emotional experience that deeply resonated with the masses. Many sources from this time report people falling into trances, being struck down to the ground, or crying uncontrollably. And even though this was at a time during slavery and extreme racism, these preachers made sure to preach to anyone who would listen, breaking the traditional barriers of class and race in religious practice, and of course, spreading their religion widely. However, this shift towards emotive spirituality also led to significant divisions within the religious communities. The awakening gave rise to two distinct groups, the Old Lights and the New Lights. The Old Lights, representing the traditionalists, were skeptical of the emotional intensity and the theatrical nature of these revivalist sermons. They preferred a more rational and doctrinal approach to faith. In contrast, the New Lights embraced this revivalist movement wholeheartedly. They viewed the emotional experiences and passionate preaching as genuine manifestations of divine power and a necessary revival of true Christian faith. The First Great Awakening was more than a series of revivals. It was a profound transformation of American religious identity. It not only introduced a new kind of spiritual practice, but also reflected the evolving social and cultural dynamics of the colonies, setting the stage for further religious developments in the history of the United States. The Second Great Awakening, late 1700s, early 1800s. The late 1700s to the early 1800s witnessed another significant religious upheaval in America. The Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, a profound religious movement in the late 1700s to early 1800s, marked a pivotal shift in American religious history, particularly influencing the South. This period saw a surge in the growth of New Light denominations, especially the Baptists and Methodists, who appealed to a broad and diverse audience, including poorer whites and African Americans. During this time, the number of local churches, particularly Methodist ones, increased significantly across the country, as shown in this graph. By 1820, Methodism had become the largest denomination in the United States. The Methodist Church grew from 58,000 members in 1790 to 258,000 in 1820, and then to 161,000 by 1860. This growth factor of over 28 times in 70 years outpaced the national population growth, which increased by a factor of 8 during the same period. The appeal of the New Light churches, such as the Baptists and Methodists, lay in their teachings and practices, like Arminianism. This doctrine emphasized individual free will in accepting salvation, a message that resonated strongly with a wide range of people. Additionally, these churches' egalitarian approach to worship and church governance was particularly appealing in the less established societies of the South and the West, where traditional church structures were less dominant. The Second Great Awakening's influence extended beyond religion to inspire a wave of social activism in New England. It led to the formation of interdenominational missionary societies and efforts in social reform such as abolition of slavery groups, temperance movements, and initiatives to reform prisons and care for people with disabilities and mental illnesses. The role of radio and evangelicalism in the 20th century. Then came the radio in the 20th century. It emerged as a pivotal tool in further cementing religious influence, especially in rural Southern communities. The medium's ability to reach wide audiences played a crucial role in the spread of evangelical Christianity. Key figures like Billy Graham utilized radio and later television to extend their reach, significantly impacting the religious and cultural landscape of the time. Their broadcasts not only spread religious messages, but also began to intertwine with political agendas, particularly aligning with the Republican Party. This integration of religious broadcasting and politics marked a significant shift, turning Southern evangelicalism into a potent political force. The Christian Broadcasting Network, CBN, founded by Pat Robertson in the 1960s, exemplifies this trend. By the late 1970s, CBN's programming reached over 60 stations nationwide, and Robertson became a respected spokesperson for the evangelical wing of the Republican Party, influencing the rise of the religious right as a significant political entity in the United States. This transformation was part of a larger trend, where religious broadcasting not only reinforced existing beliefs among its audience, but also shaped political and social opinions, aligning closely with conservative ideologies. The rise of figures like Jerry Falwell further cemented the relationship between religious broadcasting, evangelical Christianity, and Republican politics, marking a significant period in American religious and political history. Recent trends and changes. Let's turn our focus to the present day. The current scenario in this context is quite fascinating. This graph shows the recent trends in religious attendance, which reveal a complex and ever-evolving religious setting in the United States, particularly when comparing the South to the North. A comprehensive survey of 15,278 religious congregations across the U.S. has shown a nationwide decline in congregational life. Between 2015 and 2020, there was a median decline of 7% in attendance, with half of the country's religious congregations having 65 or fewer people in attendance on a given weekend, a significant drop from a median attendance of 137 people in 2000. This decline is not uniform across all denominations. Mainline Protestant congregations experienced the most significant decrease, with a 12.5% drop in attendance, while evangelical congregations saw a slower decline of 5.4%. Catholic and Orthodox Christian churches witnessed a 9% decline. Interestingly, half of the nation's congregations are located in the South, despite only 38% of the U.S. population residing there. This concentration suggests a sustained, though diminishing, religious presence in the South compared to other regions. Mid-sized churches, those with attendances between 100 to 250, have faced the steepest decline at 12%. In contrast, larger congregations, particularly those with 1,500 or more attendees, have fared better, with 71% of such churches experiencing growth over the past 5 years. This trend implies a shift from mid-sized congregations to megachurches, which often offer more resources and cater to a diverse range of ages and races. Furthermore, the religious scenario is becoming more racially diverse. The percentage of multiracial congregations has increased from 12% in 2000 to 25% in recent years, reflecting broader demographic changes in the U.S. These trends indicate a shifting religious dynamic in the U.S., with the South maintaining a relatively stronger religious presence despite overall declines in attendance. The rise of megachurches and increasing racial diversity in congregations are significant factors in this changing religious setting. Cultural and educational dimensions. To understand why the South is more religious, we must look at how religion is woven into its cultural and educational fabric. In the South, religion extends beyond personal faith, deeply influencing community and social life. This is evident from church attendance statistics, with Alabama and Mississippi showing high rates of 51% and 49% respectively, compared to more secular northern states like Maine and Vermont, with much lower rates. The significance of African American churches in fostering spiritual and social cohesion also contributes to this religious landscape. But that's not all. We also see a distinctive educational imprint of religion in the South. The impact of religion extends into the education system, particularly in private schools, where religious teachings are integrated into the curriculum, reinforcing the values learned at home and in church. This blend of religion in education and community life creates a unique cultural identity in the South, contrasting with the secular approach of the North, and demonstrates the profound influence of faith on the region's social norms, political views, and everyday life. Socioeconomic influences. But it doesn't stop there. In the South, socioeconomic factors and education play a significant role in shaping religious beliefs and practices. This influence is more pronounced in rural areas compared to urban centers. This table shows that education impacts religious beliefs and practices. Studies show that people with lower educational levels tend to have stronger religious beliefs. For instance, among individuals with high school education or less, a higher percentage, 65%, believe in certain religious doctrines compared to those with postgraduate degrees, 40%. This trend suggests that education influences the depth and nature of religious beliefs. The rural-urban divide in the South also plays a crucial role in religious engagement. Rural communities, often with lower average education levels, show higher religious involvement. The Gallup Index of Leading Religious Indicators reveals that rural residents, regardless of age group, are more religious than their urban counterparts. For instance, among 18 to 49-year-olds, the religiosity index is 664 for rural residents compared to 589 for urban residents. This pattern persists across different age groups, underscoring the stronger religious ties in rural areas. Age also correlates with religiosity, with older individuals tending to be more religious. This trend is evident across America, but it's more pronounced in rural areas, where churches often serve as central hubs for social gatherings, counseling, and community support, especially for young and middle-aged parents. This multifaceted role of churches in rural communities contributes to the higher levels of religiosity observed there. Overall, socioeconomic factors, education, and the rural-urban divide significantly influence religious trends in the South. Lower educational levels are associated with stronger religious beliefs, and rural areas, with their unique social dynamics and often lower average education levels, exhibit higher religious involvement compared to urban areas. These socioeconomic factors contribute to the distinctive religious landscape of the South. Political and social movements. Understanding the socio-economic influences in the South leads us naturally to consider another major aspect, the relationship between religion and politics. The moral majority, founded by Reverend Jerry Falwell in 1979, was a pivotal force in this relationship. It was a key conservative Christian political advocacy group, pushing conservative stances on different social issues, and was instrumental in mobilizing millions of Christians to vote. Despite disbanding in 1989, its legacy persists, shaping the religious right's power in American politics today. The 1980 election marked a dramatic shift, with Midwestern Catholics and Southern Evangelicals moving from the Democratic to the Republican Party, largely due to their alignment with the conservative values promoted by the moral majority. These issues significantly influenced voter preferences, drawing them towards candidates like Ronald Reagan. The long-term impact of the moral majority is evident in the persistent voting bloc of religious Americans, particularly influential on the Republican side. Candidates often seek to appeal to these voters by aligning with their views on family roles, religion in society, and other related issues. This bloc continues to be a significant force in American politics. This is evident in the strong support for traditional values and policies that align with religious teachings. For example, issues like family values, education, and social policies are often viewed through a religious lens, influencing both public opinion and legislative decisions. Additionally, this religious influence extends to the voting booth, where the deeply held beliefs of these communities shape their political choices, often swaying elections in favor of candidates who resonate with their values. The rise of Donald Trump as a political figure highlights the ongoing influence of conservative Christian voters. Initially met with skepticism, Trump's choice of Mike Pence as his running mate and his commitment to appoint pro-life Supreme Court justices resonated with conservative Christian voters. His explicit promises and subsequent appointments played a crucial role in his election and had far-reaching impacts, including the overturning of Roe v. Wade. This intertwining of religion and politics in the South has significantly shaped political trends and influenced religious beliefs in the region. Media and perception. So, how do media and perception shape and reflect the region's religious identity? Media plays a pivotal role in shaping public perception of the South's religiosity. From news outlets to social media, the portrayal of the South often emphasizes its strong religious roots and practices. This media representation, while highlighting an aspect of Southern culture, sometimes overlooks the diversity and complexity of religious beliefs and practices in the region. Moreover, the media's focus on the South's religious identity impacts how the rest of the country and even the world perceives this region. It's not uncommon for the South to be stereotyped as uniformly religious or conservative, oversimplifying the rich beliefs and cultures that exist within it. This portrayal can lead to misconceptions, affecting everything from politics to social interactions. On the other hand, the media also offers a platform for diverse voices within the South to express their religious beliefs and experiences. Through documentaries, articles, and social media, stories of different religious communities, including those less represented, are brought to light. This includes the narratives of minority religious groups and those who do not identify with religion, providing a more nuanced view of the South's religious landscape. However, the balance between stereotypical portrayals and a more nuanced representation remains a challenge. The predominance of certain narratives can overshadow the complexity of the region's religious identity, influencing both internal and external perceptions. The portrayal of the region's religiosity in the media significantly influences how it's perceived both within and outside the South. Demographic and migration patterns. We now turn to demographic and migration patterns, which play a crucial role in understanding why the South is more religious than the North. The Great Migration of the last century saw millions of Black Americans move from the South to other parts of the U.S. However, over the past 50 years, this trend has reversed, with many returning to the South in a new Great Migration. This reversal, starting as a trickle in the 1970s and gaining momentum in the 1990s, is largely driven by younger, college-educated Black Americans. They have significantly contributed to the growth of the New South, particularly in states like Texas, Georgia, and North Carolina, and metropolitan areas like Atlanta, Dallas, and Houston. This migration has given Black Americans a prominent presence in most parts of the South. Between 1940 and 1970, about 80% of the growth in the Black population occurred outside the South, with many living in metropolitan areas of the North like New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles. In contrast, the largest Black populations in 1910 were in southern states like Georgia, Mississippi, and Alabama. This shift indicates significant demographic changes over time. The combined effects of these changing push and pull factors led to the beginning of the Black migration back to the South in the 1970s. The South, initially losing Black migrants to the Northeast, Midwest, and West, began gaining them overall due to new migrants from these regions by the late 1970s. This shift is evident in migration patterns between the late 1960s and late 1970s, highlighting the dynamic nature of demographic changes in the region. The demographic and migration patterns play a pivotal role in the religious dynamics of the South. The return migration of Black Americans, particularly the younger and educated, to the South contributes to maintaining its strong religious identity. These patterns highlight the evolving nature of the region's demographic landscape, influencing why the South remains more religious compared to the North. The U.S. South's deep-rooted religious culture stands in contrast to the more secular North. Despite a nationwide decline in church attendance, religion remains a key part of life in the South. This raises a question. As the country's religious landscape changes, how will these regional differences impact America's future?